Hello everyone, today is August 19th and this is a meeting just to sync up a little bit on phase two since we have two new SREs starting to work on this and Philip will um, hand this over to those two new SREs and I'll be helping out as well. So um, I have point number two. I added some pre-read items. Do you have any questions around them? Feel free to say you didn't have time to look at the pre-reads as well. That's fine. But before we continue through the agenda, do you have any questions around that? Or like what phase two is, or like do you want me to run down through phase two or anything like that?
I didn't have a chance to read them. Yeah.
Okay. Would going through phase two be helpful then, or do you want to do that async?
It might be going through it quickly might be useful.
Okay, cool. So let's do that. Let me share my screen. And so um let's start with the exit criteria. So you folks are familiar with phase one, which is provisioning the QA cell. And we did all that. Now, phase two is another building block where uh, currently we have user requests going through Cloudflare, right? Like all the DDoS protection web rules and so on and so forth, and then reaching our origin, which is GitLab.com, which we've been calling legacy and cells world. And basically, we're going to add a router in front of this um, using Cloudflare workers. Now, the role of the router right now, at least in phase two, is purely going to be a proxy layer. It's just going to say, this request, I'm going to proxy it to the existing GitLab.com infrastructure. And the reason for this is the router is going to be the entry point where we decide which request goes to which cell. So for example, in phase three, we'll start using this router where we say, hey, some requests are going to go to the pre-QA cell we provisioned in phase one. And the way we do this is by specific rules. I won't go into much detail, but basically the router is using Cloudflare workers. So they're within the network path, request path um, for all the existing requests we have. And it will look at specific headers, cookies, paths, and so on and so forth, and say, okay, this path belongs to this cell, and so on and so forth. Um, it's a proxy router, so we won't look at like the body request or anything like that. We don't want to buffer requests or anything like that. We just want to proxy. And since this is going to be something that's like fundamental in the network part for GitLab.com, we have some we need to tread lightly because we don't want to affect GitLab.com at all. So the first way we're gonna deploy this is we're gonna do 100% pass-through proxy. So we don't mess anything, like we don't do a big deployment where we're deploying the router and also the routing logic for session cookie, for example, or something like that. Um, is that clear so far? Um, so the exit criteria for phase two is 100% pass-through proxy. For all requests, we split it up into API, web, and get HTTPS. Meet latency targets. So when we started designing this router, we looked at the SLOs we had. And now this isn't the perfect way to look at it, but we looked at the SLOs we had and looked, okay, high requests can only are satisfiable under 250 milliseconds, right? And then we looked at how close we are to that 250 milliseconds and looked how much headroom we have. Now, I'm saying this is not perfect because it's ignoring HA proxy, it's ignoring Cloudflare overhead, and so on and so forth. Like the metric, we don't have an end-to-end SLO, unfortunately. We only have on a per service level. So this web API and Git SLOs are from the pods level, right? So it's ignoring a bunch of things. But we came up with a calculation and what we said, it should be less than 50 milliseconds. So the overhead of the router should be less than 50 milliseconds. And registry.gitlab.com is not going to be proxied. That's something that's going to happen at a later stage because registry is a bigger beast. One, because right now it's not proxied behind Cloudflare. We tried to do that in the past. There were some issues. And right now, cells don't support registry metadata service. So that's something that we don't want to manage right now. Sorry about that. So, worker documentation, just so you know how Cloudflare workers work, if you're not familiar, they're pretty self-explanatory. If you want to look at the source code, so it's under GitLab or GitLab sells HTTP router. Did I not? Yeah, there we go. So the source code right now is pretty simple. It's just we're going with TypeScript just because it's natively supported. There were options to use WASM, so like Go or Rust or Python, but those have performance implications because you'd need to copy memory between the isolate, which is the Node.js engine, and the WASM engine. So from a performance perspective, it seemed simpler to just use JavaScript. So it's pretty simple. They do have a goal of keeping it under 1,000 line of code. So we want this to be pretty simple. And right now the rules, we specify hard code the rules at least in the beginning. And this is the rule that we're going to deploy first, which is action proxy. And by rules, I mean the router at the end of the day is going to be a rule engine. We specify a set of rules and say, okay, it matches this rule, so I'm going to do this action depending on that rule. So for example, the first cell, there's an action classify and first cell. And classify, if you look at phase stream, we're going to route by session cookie, right? And it's going to use the topology service, which is another service which the router will reach out to telling it, hey, where does this user belong to, or where does this session belong to? So the topology service will have all the metadata knowledge and so on and so forth, and the router will just reach out to this. And it will be heavily cached, like it's using caching, so it doesn't hammer topology service for every request and so on and so forth. So uh, that's phase 3, and phase 4 will also be adding stuff to the router by just deploying new rules. So any questions so far around that? Cool. So rollout strategy, we spent some time trying to think of, we want to try and not do this in one big bang for GitLab.com, at least not roll it out immediately, right? So the way we, the way we split this work, and this can change, of course, like this is not set in stone, but after we deploy the CI/CD on Cloudflare Worker in production, first we want to roll it out into 3 sets of routes. So you can roll out the router, the worker attached to a specific routes, right? So for example, in the beginning, we're gonna roll out the router only to gitlab.com/API/v for users and this user ID. Same for gitlab.com/AUFUN, and this one for a Git request. And the reason for this is we want to deploy it to production and see if actually something breaks or not, right? Like we already, Philip already deployed it in pre at 100%, and so far so good. Like even QA passes fine, but like for production, we want to just make sure we start getting some requests and do a progressive rollout. So in the beginning, we're only gonna roll it out into 3 requests, 3 3 URLs, and that would mean that we'll end up exercising the API fleet, the web fleet, and the Git fleet. And after that, when everything is successful, we'll roll it out to uh, GitLab org, GitLab. So on an API level, on a web level as well, and on a Git level. No, a Git level would be here as well. So um, up to here, it's all internal traffic in the sense. It's like, imagine it like Canary, right? Like we're only affecting internal users and we're not breaking anything. And then after that, we'll in parallel, I would imagine, we'll be working through the production readiness review, and with all the SLIs and validation we enabled, we will have initial routing with metrics for internal endpoints. And then we start looking at uh, enabling endpoints for CI runners. This would be interesting because it has long polling. For all of the API requests, GraphQL, and then action cable for WebSocket connections and so on and so forth, and then for the rest of the GitLab.com. Now, this is just a rough suggestion. Things will change probably the more we get, the more data we get, and so on and so forth. But that's one way we can try and roll it out. And there are some checks, like for example, here we need to add some SLIs and the silos around it. We need to do some performance testing, like getting A/B tests, like before and after numbers on these endpoints to make sure we don't have any latency regressions on the routes and so on. And
This is all HTTP so far. Like there is no
yes,
SSH or anything.
exactly, yes. SSH routing will not be done by the HTTP router. It's going to be handled by GitLab shell, and that is a different phase later on. So good call out there. It's purely HTTP routing here, and nothing else. And by HTTP we mean WebSockets, GET POST requests, gRPC. Well, we don't have gRPC, public gRPC endpoint, so no. So
Yet.
WebSockets yet. WebSockets and HTTP requests, basically. And so I showed you the source code for the router. There's also the source code for the deployer. So we're splitting up the deployment code and the infrastructure management from the development source code. So basically here in GitLab org sells HTTP router. This is all the source code for the router, and here GitLab.com GL-infra sells HTTP deployer as all the source code for deploying to production. So right now it only deploys to pre. Yeah, and if I can try and load the dashboard just so I show you what it looks like in pre right now. So we go here, workers and pages. There is the pre-GitLab.com sells HTTP router. So the way we're thinking of doing it is we're gonna have a separate worker deployment per environment. Cloudflare worker supports environments within. Like this can be one HTTP router with 3 environments, but since staging is in a different zone, and since GitLab.com is in a different zone, and we want separate configuration, it seemed safer to just do it separate worker deployments. And here we get all the observability that it brings out of the box. So the number of requests, median CPU time, we get live logging as well. So I'm starting here. And then if I go to pre, it will start streaming the logs here, but I'm getting all the information. And then we have the deployments. You can see the deployments happening here. Integrations, I don't think we have anything enabled. And settings. Right now we have the default setting, but in the future we might want to enable smart routing, but maybe not. There's variables where you specify the rule configuration, the GitLab proxy host, which means the IP address for the origin server, since right now we're just proxying all the requests, so we're not doing anything else. So all this is managed through the deployer
Yeah. So
repository.
all you
Right.
see here is the worker deployment itself. Then on the zone there is the routing. So
Yeah,
when we
so
deploy the worker, nothing happens. And only traffic goes there as soon as we add a route to it.
yeah, so if we go to worker routes here, we see there's one for pre. That will be right now it was a wild start, but this is managed inside of config management repository. So if we go here, and let's just go. Just gonna show you the merge request from Philip. So here, for example, we enabled it partially. So we use this pattern for his username. And then here we enabled it for all immediately. And the reason we just did it here immediately is because it's pre. But in staging, we might want to be less aggressive in the sense. I don't want to go through the whole rollout with it where we plan to do in production here, just because this might be too much work. But like, for example, we can just do API in one merge request, web in one merge request, Git in one merge request. And the reason we do that, I'd like us to do that is one, for us to create some kind of change management template to, because these will have to go through change management requests, right? And probably SC2, so we would require manager approval and so on and so forth. So getting some practice on how to create a change management request, figuring out what we need to check, what we need to add in that checklist, and so on and so forth. So staging will be more a testing ground for production to figure out the process rather than us being careful, really. Yeah, any questions around that? That I think that's all I had around router.
I think that seems fairly good to me so far.
Cool. So yeah, Philip has been doing all the work here. So I guess this is up to Philip. Like, what are the current steps, and how can Jack and Tyrone get started?
So at the moment it's deploying in pre only and it's routing everything. Next steps for staging, and there is a lot of things we are missing, is logging. How do we stream it? Where do we store it? Do we store it? Just overall look at it and see what we want to do with the logs. There are both logs that are just generic things that we get from Cloudflare that are HTTP based, and then there are logs from the worker itself. We can call runtime logs. Like would be
Those are
good.
the runtime logs are attached to the HTTP logs. So if we
Yeah.
look at and there's just for them to know. If we look at the logging again, so
One of the things we can look at it's the Cloudflare supports adding filters on logging, exporting, streaming. And that's a place we can do something like that and just
Yeah,
ship things to Kibana where we log inside the worker.
I was
Because
thinking, go ahead, sorry.
we only want to log from the runner if from the worker if something really goes bad. Like 500, like why was there a 500? Was it the worker? Because the rest we already have in a way in Kibana from the application side.
Yeah, I was thinking we can enable we can enable filters and we can enable sampling as well. So we can sample some like we can sample the requests and filter the requests as well. Like for example, we can sample 5% of the requests and also filter just for 500 errors, for example. Or there's an
Yeah,
issue to discuss this there.
the,
And go ahead.
the requests we already store in a GCS bucket, 100% of them, and
Okay.
it can be queried with BigQuery.
The Cloudflare requests.
Yes,
I did
it's
not know that.
slow. It has to be done manually, at least to load the table. We can automate it. It just becomes a bit heavy because it's a ton of data.
Okay.
In the same line as logging metrics, um, I don't think there is anything yet in the HTTP router code itself. And how do we even want to expose those metrics? And both of these things would fit into the readiness review. Um, Everything else is pretty much ready in terms of like, is it working? Yeah. Like, do we meet the target latencies? For sure. At the moment, it's taking less than 1 millisecond of CPU wall time to make the decision and route the request. And by routing, and when we say proxy, it's not really proxying, it's streaming the request. So Cloudflare in the worker changes the Node JS calls to be streamed instead of requests. So when we change the origin, it's actually streaming the call end to end. What we see in the application is that we see the same thing as if the request came from a user. Um, and that's where that logging part of the worker would be helpful because the application itself doesn't know anything, right?
The
For the
application itself now
application,
knows
yeah.
we added a feature. So
Yeah, because we had the headers, right? But in
yeah,
terms of
exactly.
like the IP, everything is as if it was from the user.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I was gonna share, we added some, and this is for you to know in the future for debuggability. Um, we added some special headers. Um, the new UI, I'm confused between closed issues and open issues. There we go, this one. Where basically we're adding two headers, rule action and rule type, and those will be logged into the various applications. So we know uh, if it was the request was routed through the router, which rule and which action and type was taken into account. We're gonna log the CF worker, and we're gonna have metrics around it as well. And this is more observability side on the application rather than the router.
Yeah. And the last missing piece as part of the phased rollouts is that we need to have a way to do some kind of health checks or some tests when we deploy a worker. Like how do we know that that version is already live? Because as soon as we do the deployment, we don't have any visibility in how far along the rollout is happening inside Cloudflare itself. So we need a way to kind of just wait in the pipeline, make a check, do some kind of tests, and make sure that it's working before we proceed to the next environment.
Yeah. And Are you still thinking of using retro rollouts? Because Cloudflare Worker, like for Jack and Tyrone, Cloudflare Workers, like when you do regular deploy, it deploys to 100% traffic for all the routes, right? By default.
Yes.
But they released gradual rollouts where you can say 10% of the traffic, 20% of the traffic, and so on and so forth. So that's something that we haven't done yet, right?
Yeah. My thinking was to just continue with the current approach, which is basically 100% when you do a deployment, and then upgrade it in staging before we go to production. At the moment, the feature was experimental and now is beta. So by the time we get to production, it might already be GA, hopefully. There is a few limitations, and that's why there was the hesitation of using the beta version at the moment.
Yep. So the way I'm thinking of splitting the work, personally, and this is up for you folks to decide as well. But since we have two engineers, we're gonna have one person focusing on the rollout stuff, like start rolling out staging, and the other person focusing on the observability side of things, how logging is gonna work, how metrics are gonna work, and of course, you both of you review each other's merge requests and so on and so forth. But like that's one suggestion I have as how we can split the work, so we can try and get the most bang for our buck. But again, up for you to decide on what's best. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'll be focusing on um, getting the most out in terms of transferring knowledge to both of you. Because I'll be leaving GitLab and my last day is 20 of September. So we have 4 weeks to transfer the knowledge and get this thing kind of working in staging.
Yeah. I mean, Philip, if you can try and focus on documentation like we talked last time, like updating the README for the deployer, showing how deployments are triggered, where the CI images are being
Yeah.
hosted, and so on and so forth, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I already have like a contribution README for the
Oh,
deployer.
sweet.
I'll be pushing it with a pipeline. I just got it working a few minutes before the call. I'll be pushing that into an MR.
Sweet. Okay. Yeah. Let's see if there's anything in the agenda. Yeah, the last two, I think they're mostly logistics. So, phase one, we did like an issue board. Would that be useful for phase two, or did you find that useful or not? You won't hurt my feelings saying no at all. Um, so yeah.
I think it would be
Issue.
useful, but we also have a foundations board as well. It just depends on if we want a specific phase board, I guess.
Okay. And the last item in the agenda is, do we want to have like a recurring meeting for specifically for phase two? I know we have a bunch of demo meetings, but I was thinking maybe having a sync meeting around phase two on a weekly or bi-weekly basis to make sure we're moving in the right direction. Would that be helpful, or do we want to do that when we see that we're not moving forward?
I'd say it might be useful. Set up something for the end of next week.
Okay. How does that sound
Give
for you
us
folks?
some time to start.
Yeah, awesome.
Yep.
So I think next action items for Tyrone and Jack would be to look at the epic as well, look at the epics and the issues. So I tried to split up.
You're muted.
Oh, I was muted. Sorry. I tried to split up the epics into small milestones. So this one is the development pass-through stuff. Like we shouldn't care much about it. Like they still have to do some logging and some end-to-end tests and so on and so forth. So it shouldn't be too much work for them, and we shouldn't be involved too much. Then the rollout for non-production, which is staging. And as you can see on staging, we split it up: API endpoints, GraphQL endpoints, and that's it. And then for internal users, this is where we put in the observability stuff. So SLI, SLOs, and I think there was something for logging as well. Yes, and just logging for HTTP router. And then this one is the production rollout. And I imagine this is where we'll do the change management issues and so on and so forth. So take a look at these issues, figure out what to pick up next. Like first, always go from top. So phase 2.2, and and yeah, talk to Philip around everything. See if you have any questions. Ask me or ask Philip, and let me know if you're struggling to figure out what to pick up next. Let me know. Awesome. Anything else?
No, thank you for the walkthrough. It was very useful.
I'm glad. Okay. Then we'll chat on Slack, and I'll set up a meeting for late next week to sync up again.
Yeah, sounds good. I'd
Is
say
this time for you okay, all, or is a different time better?
it's
No
good for
news.
me.
Yeah, no news is good news, I guess. What were you gonna say, Philip? Sorry.
I'll say that I like to start, just get familiar with Wrangler, which is the CLI to manage the workers. They have good documentation. Just deploy something. It's free. Can either get a zone of your own or just deploy in their dev domain. Just it's better to know how it works and get a start. Will be easier.
Yeah, the documentation is very, very understandable. So um, know the internals. If you know the internals, it would be good for you to know when you're rolling it out. Have a nice week, everyone. Thank you.
All right. Take care.